When comparing Tonex Pedal and Tonex software to other popular offerings from other companies in the guitar modeling category, we will notice that Tonex is much simpler than a lot. You have the Line 6 Helix with tons of different effects built in. We have Fractal, tons of different effects built in. Kemper, lots of effects built. And Tonex is much more simple, and it's by design. It's just meant to be more of a player for the tone model captures we make with the software. Having said that, I think the folks at IK Multimedia did a great job to give a very basic feature set to keep things fairly simple. We have reverb, and we have compression, we have a noise gate, some basic tools to be able to take the existing tone model and make it a little bit better, and maybe just gently shape it so that it fits our needs at the time and maybe our situation and our tastes. But there are two little controls. We could actually consider them one control, but in two different places that can really be a difference of whether we make or break the tone that we're getting out of our Tonex software and Tonex Pedal. And you might ask what this is. Well, I've had a bunch of questions about this, having done a bunch of videos in the past about how to properly use Tonex. A lot of folks have asked me about this and whether it really matters, or I've had questions as to why folks weren't getting the best results. And oftentimes it points back to this simple little often overlooked setting, and that is the pre and post switch, or actually it's just a post switch. And by setting that one way or the other, it can, in a lot of situations, have a very dramatic outcome on the sound of our tone model, and could possibly be the reason that you're not getting the results you want if it was set incorrectly for the particular purpose that you're using it for. Now, I'm not going to say that there is a right or wrong way to use it, but rather just to show people what is the outcome of setting the compressor or the EQ to either pre or post. So we're going to dive in. We're going to use a tone model from one of my favorite new collections, which is the Brit 45 Ultimate, which is a set of tone models that I created based off of my incredible Marshall JTM Studio amp, which is a fairly new amp that Marshall put out. These tone models sound absolutely spectacular. I can't get enough of them. I love the real amp, which I have sitting right here, and I absolutely love the tone model. So we'll use one of those as a demo to showcase the pre and post feature that we have on both the EQ and the compressor. And then later in the video, I'll play you the sound of a number of the tone models from this collection used together in a mix at the end of this video. So let's jump into Tonex software and see what the pre and the post button / switch is all about. All right, so here we are over in Tonex software within Cubase. I'm playing my Gibson SG today. You'll notice that I have my JS Brit 45 push one high. So this is kind of a edge of breakup or sort of second level of gain on the high input on the JTM Studio amp. Down here, I also have some tone models based off of my PRS Archon 50, which are also really killer tone models and a really killer amp. But for now, with everything set at default, you'll notice here nothing's been changed in the advanced parameters, and this is just how this preset will load up, and this is how it was captured, just with a dab of post compression and a dab of reverb. The tone collection also includes 3 levels of gain on the high input, 3 levels of gain on the low input, and then 3 levels of gain with the 2 channels jumped together, and then all the DI captures as well. So a lot in that collection. But anyways, off to the topic at hand today. You'll notice when we pull down the advanced parameters, which some folks don't even realize is there. If we never pull this down, we can start fiddling with our tone stack here and not even know what setting this post button is actually on. So we do have these advanced parameters where we can adjust the bass frequency, mid frequency, treble frequency, the bass and treble being for the shelf EQ, and the mid frequency with the mid Q being for that middle parametric EQ. The presence and depth, just as a side note, are always post amp. So these are not affected by this post pre-switch, and I'll demonstrate how we know that in a moment. And also, if we come to our compressor, we have post and we have pre. Now, how do I use these? I almost exclusively use these in post mode. I mean, there could be a situation where I would use them otherwise, but for the most part, I would say 95% of the time, I'm utilizing these simply in post mode. And you can tell it's post mode when it's lit up. If it's turned off and not highlighted, then it is in pre mode. So let's start with the EQ. So if we have this in post, that means that this part of the EQ stack, or the tone stack of the amp, let's call it, it isn't really the tone stack of the amp because it's not modeling how the tone stack of that amp reacts in real life. It's just more of an EQ. So when we have it set to post, these EQ settings are after the amp model and before the reverb. So the reason it's before the reverb is because we don't want any changes we make to this to necessarily color the sound of our reverb. We have a color control on our reverb so that we can darken or brighten that up. You can kind of hear the reverb get very bright. There you hear it. It's very dark, right? And then set in the middle, just more neutral. So you can actually have some fun with that, changing your reverb characteristics as well. Have it sit just the way that you want it to. So back to our tone stack here. So if I have this set in post, I have a lot of power here. I can set a bass frequency or treble frequency. So you can really see that I can shape the tone in a nice manner. But what you may not have noticed is when I boosted those to even very extreme settings, it didn't affect the gain structure of the amp. That amount of overdrive distortion didn't change. That's because we're not hitting anything different into the front of the amp. Anytime we change anything that's going to affect the signal that's hitting the front of the amp, it also has the high potential of affecting the gain structure or the amount of saturation or overdrive we get from that amp. So now if I was to do this and just sort of do a really extreme setting here where we crank bass, middle, and treble up, it sounds like this when set to post. Definitely colored the amp, but it has not changed the gain structure. I'm getting the same amount of saturation or distortion I was before. Watch what happens now when we switch to post. The amp is now more saturated. And if you notice, quieter. You might ask why it's quieter. Well, when we hit the front of the amplifier ends up acting as a compressor. The saturation squashes the sound. So basically the volume drops because we're not getting this volume boost. So imagine this, my guitar is hitting the front of the amp, we're in post. We have an amount of volume coming out hitting the EQ, and then we're boosting a certain number of frequencies after the fact, which are going to raise the level up. So especially here, if I turn the compressor off, you'll notice an even bigger difference likely. Hear the volume drop? So now there's nothing taking that volume boost we got from boosting these frequencies and compressing or squashing it. We're adding a lot of volume. You'll notice now that there's a lot more overdrive. Notice how it saturates more. There it's louder, but it's less saturated because we're not hitting the front end of the amp. Here it's a little more saturated, but it's being compressed, so the volume is being held down. So now obviously I'm using very extreme settings here, so we would, likely not do that, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point of what making changes when set to pre, how that will affect the amp versus in post. So now if we come back here, set those all to 0, here was our original tone, which I really think is nicely balanced. Now the presence control and depth control, as I mentioned, are always after the amp. It doesn't matter where we're set here. You'll notice that if I come here and crank these up, there's no difference whether I engage or disengage post. So those can be very powerful controls as well. Even at extreme settings, I've done videos about this before, but even at extreme settings, they're very musical and useful. If we have a little tweak we want to make to an existing tone model, if we have something that's a little harsh, we can dial some presence out. If we need some fullness, we can add some depth in. So very powerful control. So I hope that clears up what pre and post does on the advanced parameters in the so-called tone stack of the amp. Now let's get out of that and we'll come over to the compressor. Now, by default on most of my presets, I usually set the compressor in post. I add just a dab of post compression to help tighten the sound up. I do this on all modelers. I really love the sound of this. So I set that threshold so it's barely kissing the tone. When I really dig in. Sometimes if I'm playing softly, it's not even doing anything. Just loving that tone. Very addictive tone to play. So now I have that set in post. Now if I set that to pre, what is going to happen? It's going to affect what is hit into the front of the amp. Now, let's say that I cranked a bunch of gain into this in the front of the amp. Notice the amp saturates more now. Again, it makes sense. We're in pre, we're hitting the compressor into the front of the amp. If we crank a bunch of gain into this, it's acting as a boost pedal. It's acting in a similar way of using the gain control on the amp itself. So, when set in pre, we have to be extremely careful not to mess up, I'll put that in quotes because it depends on what we want, but to mess up the gain structure of the amp. Now, if I crank the threshold up more, I'm really pounding the front of that amp. Now watch what happens when I switch to post on this, and it could get very loud. Of course it does. The amp is no longer just saturating and compressing the tone even further. Now we're just boosting volume, and there's nothing stopping that volume from being out of control and even clipping, as you can hear. So that's pretty awful. Just go back to my original settings here in post. So what I've done is I've adjusted the threshold so that I get just a little tiny bit of gain reduction when I hit hard, and then I can use this when set in post. I can use the gain control just as an overall volume level for my preset because that's going to be the final output. Keep in mind, when set in post, if I use the volume control on the amplifier, the model volume, it's going to affect the compressor now. We don't want to touch this after the fact. Watch what happens to the gain reduction. Much more gain reduction with almost no volume increase because all I'm doing is hitting the compressor harder. The compressor is kicking in more and squashing that sound down. So if we have the compressor set in post, we want to avoid, after setting the compressor how we want, using the volume of the model or the tone model to raise or lower the volume because we're not going to get the effect we want out of it. We're just going to affect how our compressor is set up. If we're set in post, and I've mentioned this in other videos, we want to use the gain control on the compressor to raise or lower the volume, and that will not have an effect on the tone, just the overall volume. But set in pre, the gain will hit the front of the amp harder, changing the gain structure and saturating the amp more. So I hope that that makes a lot of sense, and I hope that that clears up some issues that some folks may be having. So set how I originally had this amp set. Sounds just like that, and a really wonderful tone that I've really been having a lot of fun playing with. The link is below if you want to grab either a free preset from this collection or if you want to grab the entire bundle. All right, so there you have it. As you can see, or at least I hope you can see, and that demonstrated it accurately, how important that little post button can be. Whether we're set to pre or post, it can really make or break our tone and can cause us a lot of issues if we don't understand what it's actually doing and how we can use it depending on the scenario we're in. A lot of folks might say, well, why'd they put it there? Well, I think it's a great thing they put it there because it offers so much more flexibility and allows us to adapt to whatever scenario we need, but we do have to understand it to be able to get the most out of our tone model. And once we do, I think it'll help us to much more quickly be able to dial in exactly what we're looking for from a particular tone model. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm going to leave you with the demo video, as I mentioned before, to the full Brit 45 Ultimate Collection, which is the tone you are hearing today, but all of the different tone models from it used together in a full production. I hope you enjoy that. So thank you guys again so much for tuning in. Please like the video, share it with anybody you think would get some use or enjoyment out of watching it. Also, please subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys again so much for sharing your time with me. Ciao for now.